In today's episode, we're going to look at the recent phenomenon of Disney's live-action remakes. We're going to specifically look at how the aspect of nostalgia, openness to change, and the ability to correct cultural missteps from the past really is informing this phenomenon and wave of remakes. I'm Jonathan Hetterly, a licensed professional counselor, and this is Psych Cinema. Psych Cinema is Shrink Tank's video series where I explore the films that I watch and love. But before we get started, do me a favor. Subscribe to our channel, click on the notification bell. You'll never miss out on any new content we drop that explores the rich intersection between pop culture and psychology. Now, as of this recording, Disney still has over 20 live-action remakes on its slate. We've already seen recent ones like Dumbo, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin just dropped earlier this summer, and The Lion King is going to be coming out at the end of this summer in 2019. And we want to explore maybe some of the reasons besides just monetary motives for why we're seeing this surge of Disney live-action remakes. Now, for those of you that are finding this like a really great trend, this is not to disparage remakes or the source material necessarily, but try to understand why now there not only seems to be a wave of them, but that the audience seems to be so responsive to this wave of Disney live-action remakes. And I really want to explore three key reasons I think is at the heart of this movement, and then I'm going to speak on one or two problems that I have with this trend. So the question I have is really, is this wave of Disney remakes really a sign of our unhappy times? So let's first explore the psychology of nostalgia. And nostalgia is this bittersweet emotion that really evokes us back to a time of earlier, happier memories. Nostalgia is sweet in that we think back to happier periods of our life. But it's bitter in the sense of that we have this recognition that that time period has passed and we can no longer return to that period of bliss. And so the Disney live-action remakes is really tapping into nostalgia, thinking back to the 90s specifically with Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, and Mulan is going to be upcoming as well, of that period where a lot of today's parents or older adults were either children, teens, or that was really a huge wave of Disney's golden era of animation in the late 80s and the 90s that they're now wanting to share with their own kids. And so what we know is when we think back to nostalgic or warm memories, it's designed to, in a lot of ways, provide us with a source of strength or resiliency. But is this wave of nostalgia really speaking to our own unhappy times? All the data and research is pointing to people today, they're less happy. They're more anxious and stressed. They feel like they have less resiliency or ability to overcome obstacles. And so when we think about the nostalgic wave of returning to source material such as Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, The Lion King, or Mulan, is it really a form of escapism that we're really trying to kind of avoid or separate ourselves from our unhappy, trying times that we're facing in our culture today? Because in some ways, nostalgia can veer over into loneliness and disconnectedness because we're looking back to the past, something that's already happened and can't change, as our source of strength and our source of happiness. And will that in turn actually just sort of amplify our present day unhappiness and disconnect? Because the question becomes, are we nostalgic for past experiences or things that, again, just sort of reinforces that disconnectedness that we feel as a culture now, where we know people are having difficulty socializing, feeling like they have friends, feeling connected, even in this era of social media and all of these technological advances that are designed to keep us interconnected. We feel more alone, disconnected. And so is that wave of looking towards the past a sign of our unhappy times? Because then when you think about all these live action remakes, it kind of maybe points to this second element I want to look into, which is openness to change. So now let's shift and look at this concept known as openness. openness to change and whether someone scores high or low in openness. So openness is one of the 5 personality traits of the Big 5 personality theory. It indicates how open-minded a person is. Those that are high in openness, they're imaginative, they're curious, and obviously open-minded. Individuals, however, who are low in openness, they are very low in experiencing or trying new things. With the wave of live-action remakes and looking back for source material for entertainment and escapism, is our culture showing low levels of openness? When we think about openness to closed-mindedness, oftentimes it's related to stress and anxiety. And if our culture is at a very high threshold of anxiety and stress right now, are we less open to change? And do we want something that's more tried and true to give us a level of derivative escapism and pleasure versus something that we're not so sure is going to be enjoyable or meaningful that requires a leap of faith? And this isn't just a Disney live-action remake phenomenon. We are seeing in the cinematic culture the most successful films from a revenue standpoint are sequels or live-action remakes. And so we're just seeing that the consumer is really looking towards something that's tried and true versus that more openness for entertainment and art that's an original commodity. So now let's look at this final aspect of what might be driving this wave of live-action remakes, which is really Disney's opportunity to correct cultural missteps of past products. So when we think about films like Dumbo, Aladdin, there's a lot of intellectual property with Disney and fairy tales that have a lot of problematic source material in today's era, where we, in a lot of ways, are more culturally and racially and sensitive, as well as we are more sensitive to gender politics as well. But one of the interesting dynamics about this going and looking back and sort of correcting some of the source material is that it's still primarily driven by the status quo. An example would be something like, well, you think of Beauty and the Beast. Well, the source material still is about a man who imprisons a female who, in the end, she's able to overlook that, see the good in him, and they get married and live happily ever after. So in some ways, I think some of this source material rewriting is kind of this convenient way of in a lot of ways, of very subtle shifting the cultural narrative without really blowing up the infrastructure that reinforces patriarchal sort of messaging, or women as princesses, or happiness is still the fairy tale of either a prince or finding true love. There's a lot of elements that are still kind of problematic that no matter how you tackle the source material can still feel inauthentic or overtly social justice in a lot of ways that doesn't feel as organic. And I would argue that sort of how our own culture is trying to tackle a lot of problems and ills in our society, is that they're really wanting it to be subtle. They're still wanting to keep the status quo, but throw little bones here and there to folks of the minority status to hopefully that they will feel more inclusive, even though the system itself still perpetuates a lot of injustice and imbalance of representation. So you have nostalgia, you have open-mindedness, and you have this desire to really rewrite historical ills. But I have a couple of fundamental problems with the Disney remakes, and this is not to say that the content in and of itself is automatically bad, but one is really some source material really just needs to be left in the past. At what point does revisiting a lot of source material that was written hundreds of years ago and trying to update it is really actually limiting intellectual property, original source material that's being written today by authors and writers and voices of minority status to create new children's content or animated content that can speak to this generation of kids that feel more represented in the animation and in the material versus continuing to recycle themes and characters of Cinderella, Snow White, etc., etc., etc. But my second biggest problem with a lot of the Disney remakes is when there's not real inspiration as a jumping off point, and that the films don't deviate a lot from the animated source material. It feels like a karaoke or a cover band. It's my life. And in some ways, that's devaluing animation as an art form itself. Simply because we can create more live action, even though it's primarily computer generated special effects, are we devaluing animation as an art form? That simply by just making the exact same film but with real people and using computers now, without deviating from the source material, saying like we want to not just update it but really expand and look at the themes in a different way, versus simply we want the exact same thing, we want to update it because we think live action or computer generated effects is more of an art form than animation, which I really think is devaluing animation purely as an art form. And I think that's a problem Disney or Americans have more so when you see a lot of animation coming out of other countries that really tackle adult themes with animation, because they see it as just a viable expression of storytelling. But what do you guys think? And I know this is a very broad sort of overview of this trend, but do you think that this is just simply the cyclical nature of storytelling and entertainment in our movie sort of culture? Or do you think that there's something deeper going on, that people are yearning for an old time period that has since passed, that we're trying to find comfort and strength in something that it goes back to our childhood or a period of innocence? Let me know what your thoughts are about this wave of Disney live action remakes. You can leave a comment below. You can also leave a recommendation. Is there a film or a topic, a cinematic topic you'd like for us to tackle here on Psych Cinema? Be sure to check us out on shrinktank.com as well, where you'll find articles, videos, podcasts, polls, and more that looks at the intersection of pop culture and psychology from a number of different angles and authors. And be sure to follow us on Twitter. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Psych Cinema. Thank you for watching. Until next time, I'll see you at the movies.